Okay, so now I get to introduce Adam. And I came across Adam because of his work with an online journal called The Side View, where he brought together an amazing set of thinkers from around the world, in particular North America, to look at meaningful philosophical problems from a different angle, and to try to understand the world in a much deeper sense. You'll do a much better job of explaining this to me. And I was just amazed by it. And I followed Adam's work ever since. He recently published a book, which I read, which I highly recommend to everyone. And I thought that he would be just the perfect speaker to end off this season, because every time that I've been exposed to his work, it's been transformative for me and helped me to see the world in a richer light. You'll do a much better job with your qualifications, but that's it. Please give Adam a warm welcome, and over to you.
Thanks. Thanks for that introduction, Ben, and thanks for setting up this whole series. If you've never done anything like this before, even though you have the space, you have a good audience, it takes an enormous amount of work just to not just have the vision. You need to have some kind of a vision. Why are we all getting together? What are we doing? That takes a lot of work in itself, but just the day-to-day logistics of putting on events like this is really quite a task. So thank you, Ben, for bringing me out. Thank you all for showing up tonight. I think it bodes well for Ben's mission here that it does seem like we have some interest in philosophy in the humanities in Toronto. This is my first time in the city, and it sounds like it's the first time for some of you coming to one of these events, so we're very much strangers meeting for the first time. But I think throughout the course of this talk, hopefully we can come together on some of these ideas. Attention is an art form. What does that mean? Ben mentioned a little bit about my background. So my background is in philosophy, quite a academic, scholarly background. Particularly interested in what we could call a practice-oriented philosophy, and I'll explain what that means, but I think it gives us a little bit of a different angle to talk about philosophy and to think about what philosophy means for us in our daily lives. So throughout this talk, I'll probably talk for maybe 45 minutes or so, give or take. You never know where my mind is going to go, but roughly 45 minutes I have prepared, then hopefully we can have some discussion. I've tried to make the talk, given that we are meeting for the first time, given that you're all coming from different places, different backgrounds, different disciplinary backgrounds, different professional backgrounds, and so on. I've tried to make the talk as self-contained as possible. But my warning to you is that there will be some technical terms, there will be some Greek terms, but don't let that scare you if it's unfamiliar to you, because I've tried to make it this, like I said, this kind of self-contained piece so that we can all kind of have this conversation together. So the title, Attention is an Art Form, I think we already honestly saw kind of a good demonstration of what I'm going to be talking about with Daniel, our wonderful cellist. I think he's already left, but it was such a perfect introduction to it, just watching him play and then asking the audience, what did you notice? What did you pay attention to? What is he able to hear in those sounds, in that music, in those notes? Very detailed, this note and this emotion, repeating this piece of the song over and over again, versus what somebody in the audience hears, what a layperson hears. We're listening to the same music, the same strings are vibrating throughout the air, right? We all have the same, basic apparatus in some ways, but what comes across to us is quite variable. It's quite variable in detail, it's quite variable in meaning. A lot of these things end up being quite personal, how we associate just the sort of sheer sensible phenomena versus how it comes across to us. And that's very much central to what we're going to talk about. So it's kind of a really perfect sort of serendipitous setup there. So on to the talk, though. Sorry, I'll leave that for 1 second. So I've been working for the past several years on a specific vision of what philosophy is and does, rooted in the sense of transformative practice and ways of living. And the person who, in my mind, has done the most to recover this image of philosophy is a French philosopher and a historian. His name's Pierre Hadot. And Hadot dedicated his career to detailing how these philosophical practices and ways of living were actually central to delivering the insights and the arguments and the perspectives and the systems and the critiques and so on that we normally associate with philosophy in the academy or philosophy in books and so on. If you're not familiar with Hadot's work, there's Pierre right there. I think we can say, he's one of these fellows who's just written so much. He's written about so many different periods of time, so many different figures, all the way from, really the pre-Socratics, ancient Greece, all the way up until, contemporary philosophy today. He passed away quite recently, but if you were to ask me sort of what are the key contributions that Pierre Hadot made to contemporary philosophy, I think you could point out 5. And this first one is something we've already touched on, is that for Hadot, philosophy is a way of life, rooted in this word that we're going to talk about, ascesis or ascesis. It means spiritual exercise is kind of the broad definition of that term. And so philosophy for Hadot consists really in these repeatable practices that shape us. And the shaping is really what's important for Hadot. And what do they shape? They shape and reshape our perception, our actions, and really our understanding of the world, like what the world is and what our place in it is at a very deep level. And so that's going to be kind of the main focus. But he also made a lot of other contributions. He's one of the key people who has kind of taught us to rethink ancient philosophy in particular by paying attention to the form that it's written in. We tend to see, if you read a lot of academic philosophy papers, there's sort of one genre. It's kind of an argument, a thesis, a series of propositions, a conclusion, etc. But his point was that actually the genres or the literary forms of philosophy are actually many. There are many ways to write and do philosophy. And the forms of that philosophical communication, say, are actually deeply connected to this transformative work, right? So if you read Plato's dialogues, the dialogue form is kind of telling you something about what philosophy is and does, this sort of back and forth, this exploratory thing, this testing of claims, this going back and forth, but also this kind of sense of like, wow, these are people who are committed to each other. There's a kind of like a friendship in the dialogue that actually makes the dialogue possible, right? And you can't really understand what Plato is saying unless you understand that the dialogue is kind of the main idea he's communicating. It's kind of back and forth. There are others, letters, commentaries, aphorisms. He has a lot to do with this resurgence of Hellenistic and Roman philosophy that maybe you've seen. There's a sort of a resurgence of Platonism, Neoplatonism, Stoicism. He has a great book on Marcus Aurelius, and there he's saying kind of the same thing again, right? Where if you read somebody like Marcus Aurelius, it's kind of repetitive and unstructured and kind of meandering, and it doesn't have like a clear linear structure to it like you would think of as like a normal academic textbook does. And there's a point to that. Marcus is writing to himself, and Marcus has some edges, and he's trying to figure that out, and he's trying to work these things through himself, through the writing. And so he needs to do that again and again and again. It's not just this thing where he's discovered the truth, he's written it down, and now he's moving on. It's a practice. He needs to do it again and again and again and again. That's how he's reshaping himself through his writing. And if you don't know that when you're reading the text, you're thinking, what's the structure here? What's going on? It's a bit of a mystery. It seems like a bit of a mess, but again, the genre is very important here. And then the last thing, Hadot pays a lot of attention to this notion of a cosmic orientation or a cosmic perspective in light of these practices. So when we see, somebody like Marcus Aurelius or, Stoicism kind of getting picked up again in the culture, we tend to see it, not always, but sometimes, we tend to see it as kind of a sort of psychological kind of self-help regime. It's a kind of an individualized thing. It's about you and your interior life and your emotions and your decision-making, right? It's a kind of therapy, maybe. And all of that's there. All of that's true. But for Hadot and for the ancients, what they really emphasized was this notion that actually a lot of these practices reconnect us with the cosmos, with nature, with the larger world around us, with being, right? Philosophers like to talk about being. And so there's some sense in which these practices get us back in touch with that, or get us in touch with it in different ways. So we have this word theoria physike, which you could translate as something like contemplating nature, right? That'd be like a very literal translation of it. But you could also translate it in a more deeper way as something like bearing witness to being's becoming, or bearing witness to nature's becoming, understanding that sort of life has a genesis, the evolutionary process is like giving rise to new form. It's giving rise to new shapes and structures. It's kind of increasing in complexity. There's all this stuff going on. And all of that has something to do with you as a person, as an individual. You are some expression of this larger process, right? And some of these practices are really about attuning you to that larger dimension. So, we can talk about, there's a sort of a little logos in your brain, in your body, in your head, this sort of reasoning, thinking capacity, this way of like giving speech to your thoughts, ideas, and perspectives. That's yours, that's unique to you. But then there's also like capital L logos, like the cosmic logos, the cosmic, you could call it sort of the cosmic patterning and shaping of the cosmos, has some kind of articulation or patterning to it, right? And that patterning has something to do with you and where you came from and why you are the way you are. So some of these practices are about getting back in touch with that, which is something that we don't, I feel at least, sort of in the modern era and on, that kind of gets shut off. It becomes this more individualized, interiorized thing. It's about you and your inner life, right? And that's not practice in Haddo's sense. So let's look more specifically then at this word, ascesis. Some people say ascesis. Spiritual exercise, that's the definition Haddo gives it. But if we break the word down a little bit, we can track its history. So first, this word askeo or askio, it literally just means exercise or training, right? And that's taken very literally as the kind of training an athlete would undergo to prepare for a competition or to build up their body, to build up their strength, to build up their ability. That's the very literal sense of it. But we also find it related to these other types of individuals, these other types of characters that aren't necessarily athletes in this sense, but they're doing this kind of preparatory practice or exercise in the same way. And so some of these are related to these kind of projects of self-discipline. It refers to a kind of a monk or living sort of like a monk-like life or a hermit. But it also, on the other hand, has this connotation of referring to like a skilled worker or a craftsman. So you can think of like a woodworker or a sculptor or somebody who works with metals, like a metallurgist. Like there's something about the practices that actually have to do with like this kind of fashioning, refining, embellishing, transforming. The woodworker is taking raw pieces of wood and making them more detailed, making them more elaborate through this skill. But of course, in this connotation, the thing that's being shaped is you as a person, right? So it has that same sense, but it's you as a being and your perception. And so, of course, you could also see the connection, the modern word asceticism there. It's connected to the sense of asceticism. You can see the similarity in the words. But it's a little bit different than how you might think of asceticism in general. Asceticism has a kind of, I would say, like a negative valence to it. It's about withdrawal. It's about renunciation. It's about negating things. And that can be part of these spiritual exercises. But there's also this positive dimension. There's a creative dimension, there's a cumulative dimension, a generative dimension. You're not just taking away, you're adding to something through these practices. And so I quite like this quote from the great contemplative theologian Thomas Merton. He again calls attention to this idea that ascesis means to adorn or prepare by labor, to make someone adept by exercises. He says in Homer uses it for the making of a work of art. You can kind of see that relationship there again. And this applies to physical culture, moral culture, and finally, religious training. It means, in short, spiritual training. So that should give you some sense for how I'm using this word and what it means. But if you want to look at some particular examples, you can find, this is one of those things where it's kind of hard to close off what counts as a practice and what doesn't. The list could get quite long, but I think this is a pretty good list. And I selected this list on purpose because I think it shows you, if you start at the top, you have physical exercises, nutrition. These are really rooted in the physiology of your body, right? This is about the low level sort of, I don't mean low in a negative sense, I just mean low in basic and primary sense, diet and fasting, athletics. You could think about yoga, martial arts, wrestling, all these types of things that really have to do with shaping your physical form, right? Same with diet and fasting. But in the middle there, you also see that some of these practices have to do with redirecting desire and passion. We can talk about like your desires and your passions being like rightly ordered or being ordered towards things that are maybe harmful to you, maybe harmful to your community, right? So there's a sense here that there's a moral valence to these developments too. There's an ethical nature to many of them. And then if you go down the list, if you look at discursive practices, number 7 there, these are also, and we're going to look at a few of these in more detail, these are also practices, like, we saw with Marcus Aurelius and his texts, he's writing and rewriting himself. He's writing and rewriting his soul. And that's true of studying, reading, dialogue, writing papers, publishing papers, speaking at conferences, making arguments, all of these things. But I think today when we think of philosophy, it's reduced mostly to number 7 there, right? It's kind of like where the thrust of the thing is. And my perspective is just, there's a lot more to it. And there's a lot more to, even at the level of reading and writing, that involves all of these other practices. In other words, to write those sentences, you have to live a certain way. And that gets kind of underplayed. And then we can also talk about aesthetics and art. And then this latter category, we're verging into spiritual traditions, contemplative traditions, religious traditions. But if you look at what is ancient philosophy, you find that the separation between these categories is not what it is today. These are very entangled things. So if you're talking about mystical experiences or moments of intuitive insight, meditation and contemplation, prayer and memory practices, these are actually much closer together. And so for me, lost the slide there. When I think about philosophy, I think about like this whole spectrum, right? And the practices themselves then shape us in different ways depending on what level of practice that we're engaging in. And so when we look at it from this perspective, we can see that philosophy is not here merely a body of doctrines or ideas or arguments, but disciplines of exercise that reshape our perception at a very basic level. And so that's the idea, is that ascesis modifies the basic structure of our perception and understanding, and they train us to get things to show up in a different way than they would without the practices, right? So things come to presence for us because of our ability to pay attention, because of how our perception is structured, because of the sensitivity of our own, sensory mechanisms. But these are all trainable. These are all plastic. They're malleable. And what shows up for us, and I mean this at like the level of first-person sensory experience, changes through these practices. And so the idea, again, is that this is actually what drives philosophical insight. You can put this into words later, and probably a lot of the insights come in these other moments, but that's really the primacy of philosophy in this sense. It's this sense that we can shape and reshape ourselves, and in doing so, our perception of everything changes. And I wanted to share a quote with you that I think really just captures this sense. This is the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing. This is a 14th century text of Middle English mysticism. I'm quite enamored of this text. This is also, you could call it a handbook more than a series of arguments. It's an instruction manual on how to engage in this practice, contemplative prayer. And the author says this about practice, and he's kind of inverting the relationship between the practitioner and the action, putting the action actually first, right? The action is primary. And so he says, to put it more exactly, let that thing, the contemplative practice, do with you whatever it pleases and lead you wherever it pleases. Let it do the working, and you be the material it works upon. Just watch it and let it be. Don't interfere with it as if to help, for fear you should spoil everything. You simply be the wood, and let it, the practice, be the carpenter. You simply be the house, and let it be the master who lives there. And so in looking at all of these different kinds of practices, going through, the history, I work mostly in the Western tradition, but, it veers out, and especially when we're talking about practice, we can talk about, practice traditions the world over. But as I was studying these practices and the changes that they kind of incur in you, I came to see that attention actually is probably the central factor in each of them. And I think it plays a central role in this vision of philosophy that I'm trying to tell you about. And I think we can see that if we accept my argument that perception is something like a skill that can be trained, that attention in its more refined moments is something like an art form, then I think we can see that our mode of seeing itself is something like a craft or a work of art. So attention is an art form in this sense. So I'm going to spend the next part of the talk talking more about attention. We're going to pay attention to attention, as it were, because I think attention really is a central piece of this whole dynamic. But it's not the only piece, right? So we've talked a little bit about practice or ascesis. I've started talking about attention, but the other two factors that are going to come into play are what I'm calling memory and orientation. So it's basically these four, right? And I think this will put us in a place where we can kind of see how through the practicing life, through these ways of living, that these four come together in a very specific kind of way. So this is the conclusion, right? This is the nice thing about nonfiction, is that there's no surprise. I get to tell you where we're going. This is where we're going to end up, and hopefully at the end of the talk, these short little phrases will make sense. Attention directs perception. Practice deepens attention. Memory holds practice. Orientation gives direction. So that's the basic idea. But let's look a little bit more closely at attention then. The way I'm going to do this is, if you've ever opened up a cognitive science textbook or, the biology of perception, studied these things in this way, you'll find that as soon as you start talking about attention, there's like this whole taxonomy of different kinds of attention, from this sort of very empirical, very detailed perspective. I'm going to try and draw some of those perspectives out, not by giving you like a list of here's narrow attention, here's focused attention, here's field attention, here, like all of these different kind of categories that people have. I instead want to look at the words themselves. It's a very sort of philosopher move, right? Like we're going to look at the history of the words. But I'm also going to look at attention, what it means, and then I picked out several examples from people who are interested in psychology, in education, in philosophy, but also meditative practices and athletic performance and art, like artistic practices, like all of these different ways, philosophy, theology, all of these different ways that these different groups of people talk about attention and how they describe it. And I think if we look at the way they talk about it, a few key words are going to kind of start to jump out, a few key themes are going to emerge that's really going to hopefully get us to think about attention a little bit more deeply. So, you need an etymology slide somewhere. And so this is attention and to attend, right? And so we have attention, it's a Latin word originally. And interestingly, it means to stretch toward, right? And you want to think about however you want to think about it, your mind or your soul or yourself, whatever's doing the perceiving, or whatever you think is doing the perceiving is kind of, it's kind of moving out and selecting specific things, right? It's not this kind of like open-ended just field awareness. It's actually moving out, stretching towards. There's a sense of direction, earnest direction of mind. That's interesting. It's earnest. There's a feeling tone to it. You're giving or paying attention. And if we look at to attend, again, there's this. If attention is this kind of stretching towards, it's also a kind of turning. So the mind is like moving, it's making these moves. There's this whole sort of sensory diorama, this whole perceptual field, but not all of it is given equal value at all times, right? So you're moving around, you're stretching towards some things, you're recoiling towards others. And that's, I think, how we think of attention. But it also, interestingly, at the bottom here, there's a kind of a watchfulness to it, or like a waiting upon something with service. That's interesting, right? Looking after something, to direct one's care. So there's this sense that like what you're paying attention to is connected to what you care about, right? So attending and caring are somehow related. I think that's worth holding on to. But let's look at some philosophers, some psychologists, and so on. This is, I think, William James, the Principles of Psychology. I think this is a pretty good account of everyday attention. He says, everyone knows what attention is. Great, I don't need to be here. Everybody already knows. But he says it's the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. That's interesting, right? Focalization, concentration of consciousness are of its essence. It implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others, and is a condition which has a real opposite in the confused, dazed, scatterbrained state. And then in the bottom one, he says there's millions of things you could be paying attention to, but not all of them interest me. So there's a sense of selective interest. But then he says, interest alone gives accent and emphasis, light and shade, background and foreground, intelligible perspective in a word. And then he says again, the opposite is this kind of gray, chaotic indiscriminateness. And I think this is generally, if you sat down and thought about like what is everyday attention, I think this is pretty good, right? But I think it's interesting that a lot of these criteria are aesthetic criteria. The qualities of attention and the qualities of inattention they have a kind of an artistry to them, right? And that's kind of how we understand attention if we really start to think about it. This is Eleanor Gibson, the great psychologist of attention and perception in general, but she spent a lot of time doing developmental psychology with newborns and toddlers, and how does the perceptual apparatus come online as you grow up and as you mature. And she adds this notion that, okay, actually attention is in relation to some task or goal, okay? It's to achieve some end. It's this active process, and it has this variable aspect of perceiving that we refer to as more or less attentive. So she's introducing a new quality here, right? There's this sense of care, the sense of turning, the sense of stretching towards, but also this sense of what am I trying to do? What am I trying to accomplish right now? So there's a kind of a telos or an aim to your acts of attention. And that's kind of what's drawing you forward, right? Is what's the aim? What am I trying to accomplish here? So I think that's a good piece to hold on to. Going a little deeper, Evan Thompson, if you don't know his work, I think he's probably done more than just about anybody to explore the relationships between the cognitive science of perception, the phenomenology of perception, and the Buddhist contemplative tradition of studying attention and perception. He's really holding all of those three pieces in quite a rigorous way. But so he adds another dimension here, right? So in seeing, I attend to features of what there is to see, but I can also attend to how seeing feels, to what the activity of seeing is like for me, and to the ways it feels different from freely imagining and from remembering. I can become aware of features I do not normally notice, precisely because they usually remain implicit and pre-reflective. So all of a sudden, we've been talking about attention as this kind of outward-facing thing, things in your environment, things in your sensory field, but he's saying actually there's this kind of metacognitive move, right, is how it's talked about sometimes. Like you can pay attention to your own attention, you can pay attention to your feelings, you can pay attention to your thoughts. And that's like a different kind of attention, right? It's the same kind of focus, it's the same kind of selective process, but in this, it's internal somehow, right? It's like an attention to yourself as you're perceiving and attending. And I think this actually is related to this Ian McGilchrist quote here, where he says attention is a moral act. It brings aspects of things into being, but in doing so makes others recede. What a thing is depends on who is attending to it and in what way. The fact that a place is special to someone because of its great peace and beauty may, by that very fact, make it for another a resource to exploit in such a way that its peace and beauty are destroyed. Attention has consequences. So I think in both of these, all of a sudden there's this inward attention, and then there's also this tremendous incursion of values into your sensory experience, into your phenomenological perception of things. So that there's two extra layers there to the process of attention. Simone Weil, fantastic work on attention, education, prayer, meditation, contemplation. Her position is basically that what you're doing in school is training attention, whether you're doing a mathematical theorem or trying to prove a geometrical proof, or you're studying a tough piece of literature or studying art. Really, whatever discipline you're engaged in, what's actually going on is that all of these things are training your attention. So in this sense, what you're paying attention to matters less than your ability to do it for a sustained period of time, which I think also quite interesting. We can take that one step further. This is Byung-Chul Han, Evan Thompson again. This is now attention as technique, or especially as shaped by these religious, contemplative, spiritual practices, right? He says, the cultural technique of deep attention emerged precisely out of ritual and religious practices. It is no accident that religion is derived from religare, to take note. There's another meaning of religare that we can talk about if any of you know it, but this is also a real one. Every religious practice is an exercise in attention. And then this is Evan Thompson again talking about Vipassana meditation. Repeated practice of focused attention is said to develop a number of attentional skills. Eventually, focused attention practice leads to one-pointed concentration. Make sure I don't miss anything here. Okay, I have two more for you. Art and aesthetics. This is Gabrielle Trapp thinking about not just the work of art, but art as a form of ascesis, art as a form of shaping, which denotes, in its archaic sense, simply a form of exercise that continually modifies, often imperceptibly, the manifold patterns of being, whether they are perceptual, behavioral, or affective, of the person who undertakes it. So in some sense, like, while you're working on a piece of art, the piece of art is actually working on you, right? It's transforming you. So there's that circular relationship there. This is Joseph Pieper, speaking of leisure and the importance of leisure and contemplation. Also, it's the same sense here. In short, the artist will be able to perceive with new eyes the abundant wealth of all visible reality. If you think about our friend Daniel here again playing his cello, the sort of sensory awareness and the sensory detail that's available to him in those moments, again, I think speaks to this. The capacity to see increases, or the capacity to hear in that case, but it's the same sort of sensory development, right? So I think whether we're talking about this kind of basic everyday perception or introspection or these kind of moral and ethical concerns, art, aesthetics, meditation, we are in the end talking about different modes of perception and attention and the ways that these can be trained or refined or even adorned, as we saw in the work of art section. And so cognitive scientists actually do have a pretty good sense of, or they have at least a theory called perceptual learning that sort of explains how these changes take place. And it's a very interesting field. I'm not a cognitive scientist. I understand enough of the concepts and the basics to kind of repeat them, but I'll leave it to the scientists to do the detailed heavy lifting. But the key idea in the field of perceptual learning is that there's basically two or three different perspectives on why it is that a trained musician hears differently from a layperson. And one view would say, okay, the trained person, the expert, has a layer of knowledge, concepts, and understanding kind of at a high functioning level, right? And they're getting the same sensory information that the rest of us are. They just have more concepts and more words to describe it. So they can make distinctions that we can't. They have more concepts. It's coloring their experience in a more vivid way. But what the perceptual learning research is saying is basically like that's not a tenable distinction. Like the entanglement between knowledge, concepts, perception, information, and understanding actually goes down really low to a really basic level. And so again, that's why I keep making this appeal to phenomenological experience or first-person experience, but that's really what I mean. And so there are a lot of, I'm going to skip that one. There are a lot of examples of this, right? So you can think of a wine taster, a sommelier, right? It's not that they have learned to name more bottles of wine or learned how to use like a lot of complicated language, although they do that, let's be honest. They're actually tasting something different than you are. Their sensitivity is actually heightened. So it's like the level of sensibility has changed, right? So that the physical reality is a little bit different. And you can say the same thing about a birder. I go out, my father-in-law, he's a zoologist, spent a lot of time doing science education. He can spot and name every bird, its relationships, it's everything about it. I see a brown bird, I see a big bird, I see a small bird, I see an angry bird. That's like about as sophisticated as it gets over here. But for someone like my father-in-law, he can really see deeply into the details, right? He has access to those details. And it's not like he sees the bird and then he has to go over here and recall, like go through the catalog and then, okay, I think this is the right word. That's showing up for him. He knows immediately what kind of bird that is. Saw that musicians, I don't know if you know this, but the perfumers have a person called the nose. This is a job. You can have a job, the nose. And it's the same thing, right? They can smell details in the notes of a perfume that other people just can't. We saw the Vipassana meditators, the phenomenologists. We're kind of doing a phenomenology of attention right now, right? And so phenomenologists, if you're practicing phenomenology in the sense that someone like Edmund Husserl practiced, you're kind of bracketing what he called the natural attitude, right? Like the take it for granted everyday experience of the objects that show up to you in your world. You're kind of going beneath that and going, hey, why am I attaching this meaning to these things? Why are these shapes showing up for me in this way? It's kind of a contemplative move, right? But so there's something available through that kind of practice that wouldn't be available otherwise. I want to be mindful of time here as well. So this is just another example. I think we'll skip it. You kind of get it, right? Rock climber sees things that a non-expert rock climber sees. It's the same thing, but particularly vivid example, maybe a life and death situation here. So the point of all of this is that I think we can say that attention is something like a first philosophy. It's the beginning of philosophy. And I mean that in this very basic sense. And philosophers might even use the term that it's not a mental state or like a subjective mood. You could say it's a structural or even transcendental feature of all of our experience. It's the condition for meaning and significance to appear at all. It's the field within anything shows up as mattering. And in this, it should be thought of as distinct from these sort of personal psychological preferences. This is like a lower level of attending. But let me move ahead a little bit just because I want to have some discussion with you all too. So I'm going to skip a few slides here, but okay. So attention, practice. This is all kind of gelling now. Are we all together? It's making sense? Cool. Okay, so the last two, memory and orientation. There's a couple of different ways to talk about memory, and I'm gonna bring us back to the role that memory plays in attention as well. But these are some great resources for thinking about memory. This is Mary Carruthers' book, Francis Yates, Henri Bergson. And there's two kind of main differences between these two and that one. These two are giving you a kind of a historical account of the actual memory practices that people use to transform their memories. Bergson is giving you a more of a sort of a metaphysical or phenomenological account of what memory is and does. But I want to look at some of the practices first and then work my way over to Bergson. So these are some practices that you can use for memory techniques, Lectio Divina. This is kind of a repetitive reading and reciting, sort of like Marcus Aurelius, writing again, writing to reshape himself. But there's distinct phases, right? There's the slow reading, repeat and paraphrase until these key phrases kind of stand out to you. You're encouraged to enter into a kind of a dialogue in a conversation with the text, and then you're supposed to kind of sit with it, not just move on to the next page. This is very, it's a slow process, it's a repetitive process, but again, you're trying to make the text a part of who you are by engaging in these repetitive behaviors. The other two, I'm going to show you this next slide. So there are these methods of loci or memory palaces. These are actual architectural diagrams that people would kind of lay out imagistically and also in their minds. So you think of a time before cell phones, before audio recording, before printing and typewriters, and when that really wasn't widely available, you needed systems to keep all of this information in your head. So you draw these kinds of diagrams. These are a little bit more, I would say these are a little bit more systemic. These are ways of sort of diagramming specific relationships between ideas. So like if you had like a a system of philosophy or a system of mathematics or science. You could visualize it to yourself in different ways, and that's going to stick in your memory in a way that it wouldn't be possible otherwise. And so what I want to say about this is that we think of memory, and even in these practices you get a little bit of it, but you could think of it as like recall on the one hand, like I need to remember a lot of facts, like I'm cramming for a test, right? How am I best going to do that? That's not really what we're talking about. That's an effect of what we're talking about. But what we're actually talking about, again, just like we were talking about, you could pay attention to a particular thing or pay attention to like training attention itself in general. And that's what we're interested in here, is paying attention to memory in general. I'll give you a nice example here. So in Mary Carther's book, she highlights, she pays quite a bit of time with St. Thomas Aquinas and his memory practices. And if you don't know about this, he had quite an extraordinary memory. And you know, there's good scholarship on this, like whether or not are they kind of embellishing these stories, are these truthful stories? Something like these stories is true. There's multiple eyewitness accounts of Thomas and his memory abilities. And so he would do things like, go into this kind of meditative, contemplative, like really withdrawn state. She says he almost looked like he was sleeping. Like his secretaries who were writing this stuff down thought he was asleep. But then he would just start reciting passages verbatim. So he's kind of withdrawing and gaining access to some kind of field of memory that's unique to him. And we have these other stories. He's dictating to multiple secretaries at once on multiple different topics, right? So writing this talk, feels like it took a lot of effort, but apparently for Thomas, he's writing 6 talks at the same time, So, okay, that's quite interesting. But so there's something trance-like about it. And so Mary says that unceasing torrent, that clarity as though reading from a book before his eyes, that quality of retaining whatever he had read and grasped can be understood if we are willing to give his trained memory its due. Thomas himself stresses the importance of concentration in memory, and we are told many times of his remarkable power of deep concentration, often approaching a trance-like state in which he did not feel physical pain. Thomas communed with his memory constantly, certainly before he dictated, and only when he clearly had the understanding and the words required, he would lecture or write or dictate. So the sense that you get is that when he starts dictating, there's like a whole essay or a whole lecture just kind of coming out almost all at once, and apparently he would wait until he kind of had the whole thing mapped out, and then he would start to write. So I want to say something about how important I think this is, especially for our moment right now. I've heard people say, we have all of these devices that can do these kinds of things for us. We can write things down. We can record this lecture. We can take notes. We can email. We can copy paste, all of these kinds of things. Now we have AI, ChatGPT, Claude, and so on. And I've heard people say, especially about these AI systems, that the important thing for education in the future, or the important thing for us in the future, won't be to remember facts, because we can just look them up. Claude can give them to us. ChatGPT can give them to us. Our job is no longer remembering facts, apparently. Our job is ways of thinking. And we have to teach people ways of thinking, not memorizing facts. But if this idea holds, that if there's some relationship between memory itself, not episodic recall, but the ability to have a memory, to have a sustained memory, then the ways of thinking available to you just really shrink. So I think that's one sort of practical outcome of this thinking. So we'll do Bergson quickly. This is his sort of phenomenological account, bringing it back to our regular everyday experience. He says there's no perception which is not full of memories. The immediate and present data of our senses, we mingle 1,000 details of our past experience. We see insensible qualities, contractions affected by our memory. So my suggestion to you is that, yes, practice and attention, but where is all that practice and attending going? It doesn't go anywhere unless there's memory. And this isn't memory as recall. This is quite a different thing from like the memory that your computer does when it retrieves a file or when you look something up on Google. It's not data retrieval, right? It's this transformation of perception. So you see, like, I tried to pick this image because you can kind of see like the coming into detail of the flower. And so if I'm out, again, looking at a flower, I'm already downstream of this like really rich memory-saturated process. And that's what leads me to say something like, okay, that's a plant, and it's a flower, and it's a magnolia. And I wouldn't be able to do that without the memory of past plants, past flowers, past magnolias, right? So we keep talking about this sort of elaboration of attention, this sort of refinement of the perceptual process, this detail coming into focus really doesn't work unless you have practice, attention, and memory. So let's see, how much time do we have? Okay, I'll go for maybe 5-10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So this is the last piece, right? Orientation. We know vaguely, again, what orientation is. There's orientation in the sort of strict physical sense, north, south, east, and west. How do I get around Toronto? I've never been here before. I'm trying to navigate, trying to figure out what's going on. But I think, we mean more something like a person's basic attitude or their beliefs or their feelings. Orientation in terms of big existential questions too, right? Like, what is the good? What is the meaning of life? Your sort of religious commitments, your philosophical commitments, these are all orienting mechanisms, right? The schools of philosophy for Hadot would give you their sense of where to go. They're orienting for you. That's what the traditions do, that's what lineage does, that's what history does, that's what the religions and spiritual traditions in their healthy forms do, is they give you direction, right? You're not the first person who's tried to orient themselves in the world. There are texts, there are teachers, there are communities, there's tradition. But of course, we often find ourselves disoriented, or we find ourselves lost. We thought we were going in the right direction, and then all of a sudden we're not. We have a sort of existential crisis. And it calls for a kind of reorientation, right? Like, we need to rethink some fundamental things about how we've been living. We need to, again, if you remember, attention has something to do with turning your mind. That's the orientation, right? And that has to come from some other bigger place. And it usually comes from some kind of big transformative event. So if you look at the word conversion, I have two words here. Conversio is the Latin, periagoge is the Greek. But we could also talk about other words like metanoia is this kind of conversion experience. But what they all have in common is there's a sense of movement, of turning. Like the conversare, the conversio, is a rotation. It's a reorientation. So when you're talking about having a conversion experience or a peak experience, some kind of transformational experience like that, you can understand it in that kind of spatial metaphor. Your attention is now being called over this way, right? The Greek has a slightly more specific term. It's not just changing direction. There's a kind of a guidedness to it, almost like there's a teacher or something's helping you kind of say, hey, go this way. You don't just have to spin around in a circle forever. Like, you could actually walk this way. There's a kind of a training, a developmental process available here. And then one thing that we don't always talk about is this com, with, together. So the vertere is the verb, to turn, but the convertere is with. And so the sense here again is that you're not just turning alone. This is the sort of, in my view, the sort of modernist, individualist, reading on this. You're an isolated individual. You have to make all these moves yourself. You're trying to figure it out. The with is with who? Well, it's with your community. It's with your tradition. It's with your history. Or it could be even something even bigger, like we're talking about theoria physicae, right? Like with the cosmos. Like, you're not separate from that. Like, it has things that it might want to share with you that are available to you if you just look in the right direction, right? So this is not this isolated individual thing. And I'm going to leave you with one final image that I'm sure you're all familiar with, that I think ties all together: attention, practice, memory, orientation. I'm sure you're familiar with this, the cave allegory. This is book 7 in Plato's Republic. I'm sure you're even more familiar with this particular image right now. This is the backdrop to however many thousands of memes at this point. But you can kind of see all of this whole philosophy of attention playing out in this diagram. So you start off down here, And these people down here, they're chained to the wall. They can't move, right? Their attention has to look forward. And what are they looking at? They're looking at the shadows. We know that, right? And we know the shadows aren't real life. But it's actually even worse than they aren't real life, because the things that are making the shadows aren't real either. These things are representations or copies of things that you find outside in reality. So if you're down here, you're twice removed. You're in bad shape. Like this is a bad spot. But the point is, like, you're looking straight ahead. Your attention can't do anything. But then, for some reason, at some point, you start to realize, like, something's going on here. This isn't quite right. Plato will talk about, these moments. He talks about wonder. Philosophy begins in wonder. Plato and Aristotle both had this sense of, like, wonderment being key to this moment in philosophy. But Plato also talks about eros, like you have a love for the truth, a love for wisdom. There's something in you that's kind of trying to, like, pull you in a different direction, right? But here you can't move. But at some point, you break free of the chains and you kind of look back. You make that turning motion, right? This is literally the conversio. You're turning around and you go, hey, those guys up there are making that. What's up with that? Like, why are they doing that? And then once you see that, you can begin your kind of ascent out of the cave, right? This is that, for Periagoge, it's not just turning around. This can be quite a tricky situation, right? When you discover that this is some kind of illusion, this is some kind of a falsity. I think of this as kind of like the realm of, like, ideology and propaganda and all of these kinds of things. But once you break free of that and turn around, you don't necessarily know where to go. Okay, I know that this isn't true. I know that somebody's kind of putting me on. I know that they're doing it to manipulate me for some reason. I figured that out, but I don't know where to go. You can get stuck there too. That's not a great place to be in either. So you need that sort of turning, but also the guided nature of it, going up. And then you get out, and of course the fire down there is supposed to be a copy of the sun, right? But it's not actually the sun. But the sun, what is the sun? The sun is like, the possibility of perception itself, the possibility of seeing individual things at all. It's not one of the things, it's the things that makes it possible for you to see. But it doesn't stop there either. Like, you can stop there, but in Plato's story and in many of the commentaries, you'll find that actually you're supposed to go back down. You're supposed to go back down and let those other people know, hey, you're being put on. Like, this isn't the really real of things. And of course, that's what Socrates does. He goes up, he sees the truth, he sees the good beyond being, comes back down, says, hey, I think you're being lied to, and they kill him. So, traveler beware. But that's the story. But anyway, the point of this is that you can see all of these different steps in the cave allegory, right? Attention, practice, memory, orientation. So I hope that makes sense to you. I went a little bit longer than I had planned to, but I think we still have some time for dialogue and questions. If you found any of this at all interesting or meaningful, that's the book Ben mentioned. You can just scan that thing or go to those websites, find me there. I'd love to chat. I'd love to hear what you think, either through email. My email is up there if you go to the website. Or let's just have a conversation. Let's see what you're thinking. Let's see what this stirred up for all of you. Thank you.
Thanks. I had a question. It's sort of an awkward question, or maybe it's sort of a request, which is that what you said was, you were like, oh, what drives insight is these experiences of ascesis, these exercises.
Yeah.
That having those experiences, what drives insight. And I like insight. And so I'm curious, like, is there something that we can do that will give me or us access to those experiences? Like, I wonder if the hard request would be, could we actually try one for a minute? Like, could we actually do one of those things for a minute if that's what drives insight? And maybe the easier one is just tell us where we could find them to do them on our own.
Find the insights or find the practices?
The practice, like my understanding is there are these practices.
Yeah.
And like what you told us is there would drive insight. I want that.
You
Yeah,
want
I'm
the
hungry.
insight.
I'm hungry for that. And what I really want is for you to satisfy that hunger for me right now, or at least tell me where I can satisfy
Insights,
it
1999 on the website. I think I personally like the sort of route in athletics, in physical training. You know, if
Okay.
you think about how much time and effort it takes to get good at a sport, or I don't know if you get good at yoga or whatever, but you know what I'm saying? Like it's a long, slow, repetitive process. You know, and there's no guarantee behind it. I think honestly, the layer of insight isn't something that happens on demand. It requires a lot of patience, a lot of repetition, a lot of commitment over, you know, really over a whole lifetime, you know, and it's a little bit like, you know, where do the great minds get their insights from? You know, a lot of them will say, you know, it came to me in the shower, it came to me in a dream, you know, but I would bet if you looked at any one of those people, the way they live their lives are making those moments more likely to happen. And I think that's the best that we can do as, you know, mere mortals. Like, I don't think you can say, okay, well, I did my 10 exercises, I still haven't had an insight, you know. But just trust that it will happen, you know, and it will happen in unpredictable ways.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. So I'm getting from your lecture, of course, that attention is something that we should cultivate and is important, which I definitely agree with. But I'm curious about how you personally configure maybe the relationship between attention and truth, or attention and even morality. And like maybe what would be your response to someone who says like, might critique attention on the basis of like, well, what if someone directs their attention towards evil or directs their attention towards like untruth?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's possible, and I think that's kind of what I was gesturing to with the fellow in the cave who's kind of loosed himself from the chains, but doesn't know which direction to turn towards. You know, I really think of our moment, you know, at least broadly, as something like that. You know, we're constantly sort of breaking free from these structures that are inhibiting us or controlling us or manipulating us, and, you know, casting off one set of shackles and then immediately putting on another set. And so for me, I think we actually need to reconnect with our history, reconnect with our lineages, you know, broadly understood, pluralistically understood, because they might know more than we do, you know. And I think that the reason that those traditions are still around is because they're specifically, you know, designed to ask these kinds of questions. One of the people that I write about in the book is this fellow Evagrius, 4th century desert father, sort of Christian mystic, and his whole book is just about this question. And he has, you know, his early Christian worldview that, you know, the world is populated not just by humans, but angels and demons and various other kinds of creatures who may not have your best interests in mind. And all of his books are basically like, you know, these sort of introspective diagnostics, like, why am I angry right now? Like, what is the anger trying to get me to do? You know, and he sees it as kind of like there are outside influences kind of trying to hook you and, you know, lead you to evil or lead you to untruth. And then he has some recommendations for that. So I think we need to connect much more with the history and the tradition of people who have thought about these questions for thousands of years, because I know that I myself as an individual will make those mistakes all of the time. You know, I couldn't do it by myself, so I don't think there's an easy answer to your question, but
Thanks so
that's
much.
what I would say.
Thank you so much for the lecture. To preface this question, I recognize that the scope of this question probably can be answered with like 3 sentences. So I guess my question would be 2-part. First of all, to share your opinion on this and maybe like some principles in terms of answering this question. And second, maybe certain books or works that I might go and check out on my own to kind of deepen my understanding in it. And the question is the following. So I am absolutely fascinated by this point that you said that when you have more knowledge, when you have more concepts in the head, when you look at a certain thing, you just perceive more and you're able to retrieve more insight. So the thing is that for me, I've been dealing with this like thing for like probably the last 2 years. So I've been, you know, taking those internal databases of documents, trying to construct like mental models for all the knowledge I have. And with only one purpose is that when I look at the problem, when I look at certain issue, I can pull out those things that I learned from this lecture, from the previous lectures, from like whatever books I read. And I still haven't found how to do it. So how to on call retrieve those knowledge pieces that I had that will help me to, some people call it think out of the box or think creatively, but just like problem solve. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, so the first one was about books and resources.
Yeah.
And I would start with Hadot, just look at his books. His books are full of references and examples from other texts. He starts, like I said, ancient Greece, all the way up to, he has this ongoing dialogue with, like Michel Foucault, contemporary philosophers, and so on. So I would look at those books and see if something kind of stands out to you. I do strongly believe that your intuition has to lead in a lot of these cases. Some of these things will jump out at you. Some of these things will interest you. Some of these things might annoy you or piss you off. That might be something to think about too. I would follow that, but Hadot is a good place to start just in general for this perspective and looking at, I listed the practices, but you obviously can get quite a bit more into like the actual regiment, like the sort of protocols or whatever. And what was the second question?
Yeah, it was kind of like your personal, I guess, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, how to make all of these different kinds of like knowledge and ideas part of yourself.
Or more like be available on call when you're trying to problem solve or like, yeah.
You just have to do it a lot. I mean, it's literally just practice and repetition, and if you're finding that the things that you're thinking about don't actually apply to things that you need to be doing, there might be a mismatch there, that might not actually be what you need, because if you need it, you'll be using it again and again and again, and that recall will show up, I think.
All right, thank you.
Hey, thank you for the lecture. My questions, I guess, is around what to pay attention to, because like I've seen, like when I look back on my life, I've gotten like enamored by some thinkers or some whatever, and I read their stuff, and like maybe it's like what they say is not exactly the right path, or like my interpretation of what they say is not right, and I go down this like 5-year journey of like being some sort of lost, right? And it's like it can be like sort of like normal day-to-day stuff, right? Like you said, like what you pay attention to shapes you, right?
Yeah.
So I could be like watching some dumb rom-com, and like my idea of what life can be like is suddenly like shaped by that, right?
Yeah.
So like, how do you think of like, is there like a guide or intuitive thing, or like what to pay attention to make your life better, I guess?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you got it. You start to become what you pay attention to the most. I almost think of it like a kind of metabolism, like your food and your diet transforms who you are. The same is true of, the art that you take in, the books that you read, the TV that you watch, like all of these things become a part of your physical organism, right? So I would pay attention to that in the same way that you pay attention to food. Some of these questions are sort of like, how do I do this? How do I do that? Like, these are very personal questions, and my ability to answer them is probably a bit limited, but I would say, I always just say, go to the greats, go to the traditions, find a tradition that you can kind of connect with as your home, see if that doesn't turn your life around,
So
just follow the instructions,
So like something that's tried and tested for thousands of years is
Yeah,
probably the best
yeah.
bet.
And, I often look at like, just in terms of this question about like what to pay attention to, I often just say like, what are the people in communities who pay attention to those things? What do they look like? How do they do? Like what's going on? Do I like their behavior? Do I not? Like, do I see something's going on? Is this a cult? Like what's happening? This kind of stuff, right? But I'm serious, like, cause you'll see it. You'll see it in people,
Yeah,
and if
that's
it's
good.
creating dysfunction, I would say, okay, it's probably not something I need to pay attention to.
Got you. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm curious, when you were talking about it as a form of exercise, I'm curious, this is maybe a question about the scholarship. Do you know if anyone's done any research into the way different types of physical neural systems interact with attention? What I mean is people with ADHD, people with different types of attention issues, which are based in physical bodies, neurology, these sort of studies. Do you know if there's been any crossover and sort of the practical research into the links between people who have these different neurological configurations and how it actually, the philosophy of following these attentions works?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know what the research on that question says, but I'd be very interested to read it. You know, 'cause I think underpinning that, right, is all of these different sort of configurations of thinking, right, or configurations of humanness, like, will reveal a different world to you, right? So at least from that starting point, you can say there's something about that world that's going to be different. But I don't know about the research, but I'm going to, now that you mention it, I'm going to look it up.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much for the lecture. Related to attention is the notion of focus, I think. And there was this book by a guy by the name of Josh Waitzkin, The Art of Learning. And in it he says, or he describes to some extent, the ability to slow down time through paying attention, through focus. I've only had this like in fleeting moments. Most of the time when time slows down is when something goes horribly wrong, you know, and you're sort of adrenaline's pumping, you're trying to sort of just, you know, soften the fall or whatever. Have you found that you're able to, not on demand, I mean, that's a little get rich quick, but more often than you know, a past version of yourself was able to, have you found that you're able through this practice to, you know, make moments last longer?
You know, I think probably what's happening there is that you're just aware of so much more in each moment.
Right.
That the sort of the density of each moment is great or different. Say maybe it's not more dense, maybe it's lighter. You know, I think that's what's happening. But yeah, I think, you know, I think a lot about, you know, sports, combat sports, different kinds of athleticism. You know, you can see people who are just operating. You know, it looks like they're in the future.
Yeah.
You know, you watch like high level boxing, high level martial arts, and just people who's like, I know you're going to be here in 1.5 seconds. I'm going to be over there.
Right.
You know, so there is some temporal dimension there, right, where they're processing things much faster, and it's a meaningful processing. They know what's going to happen. But yeah, it's an interesting question.
And then the reason why I say that is sort of the notion.
I apologize. I should have said at the beginning, no 2-part questions. This was my mistake. I apologize.
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
Thank you for the lecture. Why are you interested in attention?
Why? Yeah, that's a good question. So it started with this other word practice, ascesis, right? And then on the one hand, I realized that, you know, a lot of these practices actually depend on different kinds of attention. I was thinking about perception at first and then kind of narrowed it down to just attention, just out of my own curiosity. Do these things have anything in common? And I thought attention is one of them. But then obviously today I think of the things I've written, the things that people seem to respond the most to is this writing on attention and memory. And I think that's because of our present moment. And I think that's why it's really important right now is like what we're dealing with is like a fragmentation of attention, like a lot of systems and structures and technologies that are sort of actively working against our ability to pay attention. So all of a sudden, like when something breaks or when something doesn't work, that's when it shows up. That's when it becomes meaningful. You realize, oh, we haven't been paying attention to attention. Our attention is at risk. You know, so we need to think more deeply about how do we cultivate attention. What is attention? Do we even know? Like, let's look at it. So I think there's something like really timely. And the same thing, you know, I mentioned this link with like memory and AI. You know, I just heard that phrase so many times. Like, you can offload the facts and the memorization over here, but then actually, no, your memory and your attention are like very closely linked. You know, so for me, like, there's a need for this kind of thing in the moment right now because of our situation. If you Google my friend and colleague Eric Davis, he wrote a great essay. It's online. It's called "Attention is a Martial Art," where he kind of he takes a very similar sort of practice-oriented, sort of a meditative approach to attention, but then says actually you can do a kind of a jujitsu with attention through all of these things that are kind of trying to cannibalize and attack your attention. So that's kind of why it's important right now, I think.
Thank you.
Hi. What a lecture. So, okay, I'm not asking this question because I think that there is, I don't know, I think that cultivating attention and sort of developing it as a practice like it speaks so much to what you just said. We're in this time where there are a lot of forces that are a lot bigger than us conspiring to kind of undermine our attention. But I think with any change, there's something gained and something lost. And I think about this a fair bit, but like my question I really haven't considered until today. What is lost when you cultivate attention?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it lies in the fact that attention is selective, and I think we saw that in some of the descriptions, that it brings certain things into the foreground and certain things into the background. We didn't talk too much about it, but like I said, like the science of attention, or you sort of like the more technical philosophy of attention, really breaks it down into like a sort of like wide open field awareness versus this kind of focused, concentrated attention. And I think whichever kind of mode of attending you're engaged in, you're losing something. And that's the nature of our existence. It's like everything kind of comes at a cost of something else. You can only look at an object from one perspective at a time. I'm looking at the front, I can't see the back, And it's just a question of like, it becomes a question of like skillful means, right? Like what guides what you're going to pay attention to.
Like a depth instead of a breadth, maybe.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Just a quick piece in. I think we probably have time for 3 more questions at the current rate. So that's probably yourself. And so apologies. I think Adam will stick around afterwards if you want to grab him for a question.
Thank you for your honesty and the way you do that. Your presentation feels, it's clear that you embody this practice. And that is kind of my question as well. Like, one thing I find so useful about this and about presentations is, like, you have landed on all this knowledge, and I'm sure over the time of your life, you've integrated these into practices for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, like, upon discovering this, what did you do? Like, if you could tell the story.
3 minutes.
One more lecture.
I mean, I can tell you very quickly that, I had a lot of disparate interests. Some of them were very intellectual. Some of them were very physical. Some of them had to do with sort of religious and transcendent experiences. Some of them had to do with psychedelic experiences, honestly. And just, it's not an advertisement. But coming to all those things is just kind of like sort of native interests, like this thing, then this thing, and this thing. And then finding somebody like Hadot, I realized like, oh, actually, there's a way of reading philosophy where all of these things live together and come together. They don't have to be antagonistic. They don't have to be separate disciplines. This is actually quite a good and rich account of philosophy at its origin. It looks something like the combination of those things. So that Hadot helped me kind of narrate that for myself.
Thanks.
So it just so happens that my question is about psychedelics. Because when you were telling us about ascesis and how it fundamentally changes our perception, I thought that one thing that was missing from the list that you showed on the screen is psychedelic experiences. So I'm curious, I mean, is that a coincidence that psychedelic experiences and all of the practices you listed seem to do something very similar in terms of our perception of the world? And are psychedelics just an easy way out?
I think of psychedelics as a smaller subset of if you think about Byung-Chul Han, that quote I shared, religious technique, religious practice, religious ritual. These are all ways of helping you to have those shifts in perspective, those transformative experiences, right? With the right guidance, the right setting, the right community, the right instruction. And psychedelics, I think, fits inside of that picture. I also think that there can be a tremendous downside to psychedelics. I've gone back and forth on this question throughout my life, from very positive sort of boosterism to now a much more tentative stance. But but yeah, I mean, they're one of the tools. They're one of the techniques, right? And if you're familiar with this world, you know how much set and setting and protocol and preparation and everything like really influences. So I think, yeah, it can give you like a very obvious, high level, sort of intense demonstration of what these traditions are talking about kind of in a more general sense.
Thank you.
Hi, I don't know. Okay. Yeah, I just want to say first thank you for the presentation. I really appreciated it. So I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on this. So I feel as if like people, and by people I'm also including myself, often think that they first need to pay attention to themselves, understand themselves and their feelings, etc., before they can kind of pay attention to other people and society as a whole. A sort of like me before thee attitude, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But would you say, or like, what are your thoughts on the opposite kind of being true? Like, the more we pay attention to others and to the things going around us in society, we can kind of help to understand ourselves, help understand our participation in this world, and kind of like our meaning and purpose of like why we're here and why, and like what we're supposed to do here.
I definitely lean more towards the second description that you just gave, but I think so many of these questions, like I said, have so much to do with who you are as a person and where you're at. Like the reverse could be true for somebody else. I can imagine a person who doesn't think about themselves at all, ever, and that leading to some bad outcomes. But what I like about, linking practice and attention, I mean, another way of saying that is like acting and attending like come together, and it's actually like in the doing that your perception changes, right? So I'm not sure that there's even that strong a dichotomy there between the two. I think as a kind of a general mood, a cultural mood, I keep saying this, but I think it's true. I think we're encouraged to live this kind of individualized life of interiority, so you're ruminating too much, you're depressed, you have anxiety, whatever, and the solution is to like obsessively think it through in your head. Like, which I don't think that's going to help, So yeah, I would lean more towards the second, but like I said, it's all of this is so contextual, Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Can we give it up for Adam one more time? That was amazing.